Hi, I am Azhar Pasha Syed and I welcome you to this part of the screencast. This is our lab setup and that's our root domain controller. And we also have a child domain controller which will be in the child domain, and we have a second child domain controller in the second site. So that's our lab setup for today. So let's go ahead and start the installation of our root domain controller. So the task here is to deploy a new forest with a new root domain controller. To begin with, let's look at the network configuration. As you can see here, the IP address of the DNS should point to itself, which is .4 in our case. That's pretty much in place for us to go ahead with the Active Directory installation. So this is our root domain. We launch by running dcpromo, and then we go ahead with the wizard and select the new domain creation, and then we put in our root domain name, which is root.ad in our case. Once we put in these details, we just go on to next screen, which is the NetBIOS name of this domain, which will be also root, and we pick up the functional level of the forest, which will be Windows 2008. Ensure that the DNS is selected here and ignore this warning. This is the place where you would put your AD on, and then you put in the password which is required in case of any recovery. Once you put in the password, you click next, and it's pretty much a job done. You can export the settings if you want for any documentation purposes here. You click on reboot on completion, and that's it. The job is done now and the root domain is up and running. Let's now perform some checks. Let's first go and check on the AD users and computers to make sure that the required OU structure is in place. So the required OU structure is in place. This is how it should look like, with the domain controllers and the root domain controller on that list. And of course in the users you would see all the groups created here. So we are pretty much in good shape as far as the installation is concerned. Let's also look at Active Directory sites, and as you can see here, the Active Directory default site has got the root domain controller, and this is what is expected. And also make sure that the DC is also a global catalog server. It is anyway by default a GC when you install the first domain controller in your domain. Now let's also examine the DNS. Make sure that the DNS setup has this structure. So that's pretty much it. We are, I think, in a good shape as far as the root domain controller is concerned. Now it's time for us to create a new child domain and deploy child domain controller. So to begin with, we check the network configuration and we make sure that we have the DNS server pointing to our root domain controller, because that's the only one existing right now in our infrastructure. And this setup also creates something called DNS delegation, which we'll see in a moment. Let's launch again the dcpromo. To start off the installation of Active Directory, we use the advanced mode. We click next, and then we go ahead and check existing forest and create a new domain in an existing forest, and then click next, and we are on to the next screen where we have to provide the root domain name, which is root.ad in our case, and then we set the credentials required for our root domain. Click next here, and as you can see, the next screen would be name of the parent domain, which is root.ad, and you will have the child domain name, which is child. So the full name would be child.root.ad, and the NetBIOS name of course would remain the same, which is child. It's good for us to have it the same way. And then we have the DNS and the global catalog selected here, and the domain controller that we contact is root DC. Click next here, and then we'll see the location where we'll be keeping our AD files, which is the default, and then we put in the password that we may require in case of any recoveries in future. Where we would see create DNS delegation is selected by default. Delegation, what exactly is delegation? You can go to Microsoft sites to find out. It's good to have delegation, and that's it. That's reboot on completion, and once it's completed, let's look at the root domain controller and check on the DNS. As you can see, on the DNS there is a child zone created. So this is expected, and this is how it should be. The child DC should be reflecting in the root domain controller. Now it's time to rename our default AD site, create new branch office AD site, and define some subnets. So let's launch AD sites, and let's go to the default site and rename this site to HQ. So our headquarters has the root domain controller and the root and the child domain controller as well. And we create a new subnet and attach this subnet to a particular AD site. So this is our subnet which we would like to associate with the HQ site. So any computers in this subnet would be talking to the DCs which are in HQ site. Let's create a new site and name it as branch office. Just click OK here, and the site would be created once you go ahead and finish the process. Let's now define a new subnet, and our new subnet would be 192.168.2.0/24. not 2.0, it should be 3.0 subnet, and we will map it to branch office. So any computer in that range would be talking to the domain controllers in branch office. This is how we associate subnets with AD sites. We can also create empty sites. Now we have a task list which is to verify the DNS on the child DC to make sure that the structure exists. And also, if you look at the network properties here on the interface, you would see that the root domain controller IP has automatically been shifted to second preferred domain DNS server, and the first one is the local server, which is 127.0.0.1. Okay, and move on to verify the DNS to learn if the DNS setup is in place as expected. If you expand the DNS structure, you will notice that the DNS structure is as we require and as we have earlier verified on the root DC. So this is expected installation behavior, and it's clean at the moment. Let's also verify AD users and computers to make sure that the OU structure is in place for the child domain this time. Yeah, it's all in place, and we have a DC listed here, and it's also a global catalog server. Let's look at now the task list, which is to deploy DC in the branch office. DC is child domain. We notice that the branch office site is already pre-created. Now this is the domain controller that's going to be a domain controller in the second site. So to do that, we point the DNS to the child DC that we already deployed in our site 1, which is HQ. So the DNS is pointed to the HQ domain controller right now, and we are deploying again the same procedure, DC promo. We go through the wizard. This time we be careful on the options that we pick. We select the existing forest, and here in this field we'll put in the child domain name, which is child.root.ad, and we'll provide the credentials required to log in to the child domain. So we're pointing here to the child DC, and we are going to notice here that it's automatically going to pick based on your site configuration that you have done. We'll make it a DNS as well as the global catalog. Click next. Provide the credentials. I'm deliberately providing wrong credentials here just to learn what happens if you go through this wizard, and you would also notice what exactly happens now. So it's going to replicate with the existing domain controller in the site 1, which is fine, which is this one, which is child-dc-s1, which we deployed earlier. We click next here, put in the password required again for recovering in case of any failures. Click next and click reboot on completion and wait for the system to reboot. As you can see here, it's again pointing us and asking us the password for updating the DNS delegation on the root domain controller. So we provide root specifically here and then put in our Active Directory login credentials for the root domain, and that's job done. Once we click next, and then let's go to the root domain controller and look at the DNS. On the DNS, you would notice that the structure exists in the child domain, zone is created here, and DCs are populated. Let's now look at the AD sites and to see if the branch office has got this DC automatically populated. This is to show you that the sites can be pre-created. As you can see, the child DC exists in the branch office.